I was sitting at my kitchen table in Guelph, Ontario, with a pot of Earl Grey going cold beside me, when my daughter said the words that changed everything. She did not shout them. She did not even pause to consider them. She said them the way you say something you have been rehearsing for weeks, something polished and rehearsed until all the cruelty has been buffed smooth. Mom, honestly, you should think about scaling back. You don't need to be this comfortable when we're the ones struggling. That was the night I understood, with absolute clarity, that I had spent 11 years mistaking obligation for love. The afternoon had started simply enough. I had driven the 40 minutes from my house to their place in Oakville with a container of butter tarts I had baked that morning and a birthday card for my youngest grandchild. October in Ontario has a particular quality of light, the kind that turns the maple trees into something almost painfully beautiful, all amber and copper along the highway. I had the radio on low, a program about gardening on CBC, and I remember feeling quietly content. Grateful, even. I thought I was going to spend a few hours with my family. My daughter met me at the door before I could knock. She had that particular expression I had learned to recognize over the years, the one where her smile was present, but her eyes were already somewhere else, calculating something. She let me in without a hug. My son-in-law was on the phone in the kitchen, pacing, speaking in the low, urgent voice he used when money was involved. The house smelled like a candle that had been lit specifically for company. Not for me. For someone else who had been there recently, or someone expected later. The grandchildren were upstairs. I could hear them, the older one on some video game, the younger one calling out questions nobody was answering. I asked if I could go up and see them. My daughter waved a hand. Give it a few minutes, they're in the middle of things. She steered me toward the living room instead. A room so carefully arranged it looked more like a photograph than a place where people actually sat. My son-in-law finished his call and appeared in the doorway. He nodded at me, the way you nod at a delivery person. Then he said something to my daughter in a low voice, and she turned to me with that smoothed-over smile again. We actually have some people coming by later tonight, Mom. So we can't do a long visit. I told her that was fine. I just wanted to drop off the birthday card and the tarts. She took the container without looking at it. The card she set on the counter. I sat for perhaps 20 minutes. Nobody offered me tea. My son-in-law disappeared back into his office. My daughter looked at her phone more than she looked at me. When I mentioned that my furnace had been making a strange sound, and I was worried about the winter ahead, she said, without looking up, "You're probably just used to keeping the house too warm. A lot of older women do that." And then, when I mentioned that my CPP and the small pension from my nursing years was feeling stretched lately, she finally looked at me, fully, directly, and she said it. "Mom, honestly, you should think about scaling back. You don't need to be this comfortable when we're the ones struggling." I did not respond right away. The word struggling sat between us, like something dropped on the floor that neither of us wanted to pick up. I looked around the room. The new sectional sofa that had been delivered 2 months ago, still carrying the faint chemical smell of fresh upholstery. The television mounted on the wall, large enough that I could see my own reflection in it when it was off. The framed art prints my daughter had told me cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I thought about struggling. I thought about what that word meant to me, and what it apparently meant to her. I drove home in the dark. The maple trees had lost their beauty. Everything along the highway just looked cold. That night, I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. I sat in my kitchen with the overhead light on, and did something I had been putting off for longer than I could justify. I went to the old accordion folder I kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one labeled simply household, and I brought it to the table. I had never laid it all out at once. Each item had arrived separately, spaced out over months and years, in ways that kept any single request from feeling large. A mortgage payment here, a car insurance top-up there, a dental bill during a tight month that became a recurring transfer, without my ever formally agreeing to it becoming permanent. I had added things quietly, the way a person adds weight to a backpack one item at a time, never stopping to feel the total until their knees start to buckle. I spread the papers across the table and began organizing them by type. I found bank statements with highlighted transfers, printed invoices for subscriptions I had never used, car payment confirmations for 2 vehicles, neither of which I had ever sat in, my daughter's gym membership, which I had apparently been renewing quarterly for 4 years, private school application fees, a wine club that delivered monthly to their address, a streaming service bundle, landscaping, a meal kit delivery that cost more per week than I spent on groceries for myself. I counted slowly, moving each document to the right as I confirmed it. When I finished, I went back and counted again, because the number seemed wrong. 89. 89 separate recurring expenses flowing out of my accounts and into the architecture of their life. I pulled out my old calculator, the one from my nursing days I had kept, because I could not bring myself to throw away something that still worked, and I added up the monthly total. My breath left me. The number was nearly double what I received from my CPP and pension combined. I had been quietly draining my RRSP, the savings I had spent 32 years building during overnight shifts and double shifts and every holiday I had ever worked, to cover the difference. I looked around my kitchen. The laminate countertop with the bubbled corner I had been meaning to repair since last spring. The drafty window above the sink that I sealed every October with plastic film from the hardware store. The furnace that made that sound. I had been telling myself for years that I simply was not a person who needed luxury, that I was practical, that I preferred things simple. I had not preferred things simple. I had been paying for their complicated life and calling the remainder of mine simple. I sat at that table until after midnight. I did not cry. Something shifted too far past crying into a territory that felt more like geology, like a slow continental movement that had finally reached a breaking point after years of invisible pressure. By the time I stood up and placed the folder back together, I was not angry. I was decided. The next morning was a Tuesday in late October, gray and still, the kind of morning that feels like a held breath. I dressed carefully. Navy wool blazer, the one I wore when I wanted to feel grounded. I drove to my branch of the Royal Bank on Stone Road. I had been banking there since I was 26 years old and had just started my first nursing position at Guelph General Hospital. The branch manager, a composed woman named Patricia, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, had helped me navigate my husband's estate paperwork 3 years ago. She knew me. When I walked in and asked for a private meeting, she did not ask questions. She simply stood up and gestured me toward her office. I placed the accordion folder on her desk. I said, I need to cancel every automatic transfer and pre-authorized payment going to accounts outside my own name. All of them. Patricia sat very still for a moment. She asked if I was certain. I told her I had never been more certain of anything, since I agreed to take the night shift so a colleague could attend her daughter's school play 20 years ago. Patricia turned to her computer. As she pulled up my accounts and began working through the list, her fingers paused over the keyboard. She looked at me carefully. Dorothy, she said, using my name in that quiet way that meant something serious was coming, there's something flagged on your home equity line of credit. An access request came through last week. The application listed a joint account holder being added. The name was not yours. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. I asked her to repeat it. She repeated it. The name my daughter had used. An attempt to have herself added to my home equity line of credit, the one I had carefully maintained and almost entirely paid down over 15 years. The request had been flagged because the supporting documentation included signatures that the bank's verification system had marked as inconsistent with my file. Did it go through? I heard myself ask. No, Patricia said. It was put on hold pending your confirmation, which never came because the contact number listed was not yours. A different phone number. My daughter had listed a different phone number so that the confirmation call would route somewhere I would never hear it. I sat with that for a long moment. This was not carelessness. This was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over at a kitchen table. This was a plan, careful, deliberate, and built on the assumption that I would never look. I told Patricia to deny the request, freeze the line of credit, add fraud alerts to every account, remove all secondary access, and change every piece of contact information to reflect only my own details. She asked if I wanted to file a formal report. I said I wanted to preserve the option and asked her to document everything thoroughly. She nodded with the calm competence of someone who has seen this particular kind of wound before and knows exactly how to dress it. When I walked out of the bank, the October air hit my face like cold water. I sat in my car for several minutes without starting it. The parking lot around me carried on with its ordinary Tuesday business. People carrying reusable grocery bags, a father lifting a toddler into a car seat, a man arguing pleasantly on his phone. The ordinary world. I was still in it, even though something had permanently rearranged itself inside me. I drove home and put on the kettle and waited. I did not wait long. The first message came at 11:17 that morning. My daughter, asking why the automatic transfer to their joint account had not processed. She wrote it the way she wrote most things to me, as a statement rather than a question, as if the money's failure to arrive was a mechanical error I needed to correct. I read it. I set the phone face down. The second came 40 minutes later. The car insurance payment had bounced. Could I look into that? My son-in-law's name this time. His tone clipped and foreign to warmth. I turned the kettle off and went out to rake the backyard instead. My backyard in October is something I have always loved. The old silver maple at the back fence drops its leaves in one long, unhurried conversation, and raking them into piles feels like putting a room in order. I worked steadily, listening to the sound of the rake against the grass, while my phone buzzed intermittently in my sweater pocket. I did not look at it. By early afternoon, the messages had changed. My daughter's tone had moved through confusion into something sharper. The private school fee had not processed. The gym membership had been canceled. The meal kit service had sent a failure notification. She listed these things one by one in a string of messages, each one stripped of its earlier smoothness, the polish coming off with every failed payment like paint in rain. Then, "Mom, I need you to call me right now. This is not okay." Then, "This is completely irresponsible. We have commitments. We have a family." Then, near 4 o'clock, a message from my son-in-law. "Dorothy, I don't know what's happening, but if there's an issue with your accounts, you need to let us know immediately. This is affecting our mortgage pre-approval process." I sat on the back steps with my rake leaning against the fence and watched the light going thin over the yard. A mortgage pre-approval process. They had been in the process of taking on more house, presumably, more beautiful things, more commitments they had quietly assumed I would absorb without complaint. I stayed on those steps until the cold settled into my knees and told me it was time to go in. That evening, just past 7, someone knocked on my front door. 3 sharp knocks, not the gentle tentative knock of someone uncertain of their welcome, but the knock of someone who expects the door to open because it always has. I knew the sound. My son-in-law filled the doorway. He was wearing the same expression I had seen in people who come into emergency rooms, having convinced themselves they are fine while bleeding, the particular tight calm of someone managing panic with their whole face. He asked if he could come in. I stepped back and let him. He sat at my kitchen table without being invited to sit, which told me everything about what this conversation was going to be. He started by asking if something was wrong with my accounts, whether I had received some kind of phishing communication, whether I had accidentally changed settings on my banking app. I let him finish. Then I placed the accordion folder on the table between us. He looked at it. I told him to open it. He did. Slowly at first, then faster, his eyes moving across the pages, with an expression that kept shifting between recognition and something that looked almost like shame, though I was not certain he had arrived there fully yet. He went quiet for a long time. "I didn't realize it was organized this way," he finally said. I told him I understood. Because the whole design of it, the gentle accretion of one small transfer after another, the assumption that I would simply manage it without complaint, the way each individual item had been small enough that raising it would have felt petty, all of it had been designed so that nobody would ever need to fully realize anything. Least of all me. He tried several other doors. He mentioned stress. He mentioned the cost of living in Ontario, which is real, and I know it is real. But I also knew that real financial pressure does not purchase a wine club subscription. He mentioned that my daughter had anxiety about financial instability, which I received with the stillness of someone who spent 3 decades in a hospital, watching people face things that were genuinely unsurvivable. I opened my folder to the page I had marked, the page with the documented attempt to access my home equity line of credit, the page with Patricia's notation, the mismatched signatures, the wrong phone number. The color left his face the way the sun leaves a room when a cloud comes over. "She didn't tell me she did that," he said quietly. I told him I believed him, and I told him that whether he knew about it or not, the outcome was the same. Someone in his household had sat down and with deliberate care had attempted to bind me legally to a debt I had no knowledge of, using my name, my credit history, and 32 years of RRSP contributions as the foundation of a life that had never once asked my permission to grow. He stared at the table. I told him that every automatic transfer had been canceled, that my accounts had been secured, that I had documentation of everything, and that I had preserved the right to take this further. I told him this was not an argument, and I was not asking him to respond. I was telling him so that there would be no confusion later about whether I had been unclear. He left without raising his voice. At the door, he paused. He turned around as if he had something to add. Then he seemed to decide against it. I watched his car pull out of my driveway into the dark street, and I stood at the window for a moment before I locked the door. My granddaughter called 2 days later. She was 19 and had just started her second year at the University of Waterloo, studying environmental sciences. She was the kind of young person who made me believe that something in the world was going to be all right, not because she was optimistic, but because she paid attention. When I answered, her voice had the careful quality of someone who has been rehearsing, not what to say, but how to say it without falling apart. She told me the house had been difficult, that her mother had spent the first night on the phone, calling people whose names my granddaughter did not recognize, speaking in that low, urgent voice that appears in a household when something structural has given way. She told me her father had been quiet in the way that frightened her more than shouting. She told me she had overheard a conversation between her parents that she had not been meant to hear, and that in that conversation, her mother had said, "We just have to make her understand that we need her more than she realizes." I told my granddaughter that I understood, and that I hoped she knew that none of what was happening was anything she needed to carry. Then she said, "Grandma, I also need to tell you something I found." Her voice changed slightly, the careful rehearsal falling away into something more urgent. She had been in her parents' home office looking for her own university enrollment papers, which were kept in a filing cabinet alongside the household documents. Behind her own folder, she had found a printed email thread between her mother and someone identified only as an accountant contact. The thread discussed options for what was described as leveraging a property asset held by an elderly family member and referenced my home address specifically. My home, the house I had purchased in 1997 and paid off in 2019. The house where I had raised my daughter, where she had come home from the hospital as a newborn, where she had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway, where I had sat up through fevers and heartbreaks and every ordinary crisis of her growing up. That house had apparently been assessed as an asset that could be leveraged. I sat down. My granddaughter asked if I was all right. I told her I was, which was and was not true in equal measure. I thanked her. I told her she had done the right thing in telling me, and that she should not feel guilty about it because the truth is not a betrayal, it is a gift, even when it comes in a difficult package. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me she had just gotten a part-time job at a cafe on campus and had opened her own TFSA account with her first paycheck. She said it with a particular kind of pride, not boastful, just solid, like someone who has just placed both feet on ground they know will hold. I told her I was proud of her in a way I did not quite have words for. I called a lawyer that Thursday, a woman I had been referred to by a colleague from my nursing years, someone who specialized in elder financial matters. She reviewed my documentation with the thorough, unhurried pace of someone who had seen many versions of this particular story, and she told me I had grounds for a formal complaint regarding the attempted access of my home equity line of credit. She also told me that the email thread my granddaughter had photographed, documenting intent to leverage my property without my knowledge, was material worth preserving. We moved forward carefully and without urgency, because careful and unhurried, I had learned, is how lasting things get done. In November, my daughter called. Not with demands this time, not with the efficient staccato of someone accustomed to having things processed. She called from the driveway of their house, I learned later, sitting in the car, because she did not want my son-in-law to hear. Her voice had a quality I recognized from decades in nursing, the voice of someone after a long acute phase has passed, and the reality of recovery has finally set in, tired, stripped of its arrangements. She said she did not know how to start. I told her she could simply start. She said she was sorry. Not the apology that comes attached to requests. Not the apology that arrives with conditions on the other end of it. She said she was sorry in the way a person says something, when they have sat with it long enough that it has changed shape, become something heavier and more honest than what they started with. I listened. I did not rush to make her comfortable. I had spent too many years making her comfortable at the cost of making myself invisible. I told her that I loved her, because I did, without qualification or interruption. I told her that love was not the same thing as a financing arrangement. I told her that I had spent 11 years treating the two as interchangeable, and that neither of us had been well served by the confusion. She was quiet on the other end for a long time. I could hear the sound of her car, the particular silence of someone sitting in a driveway in November in Ontario, the cold just beginning to mean what it will mean for the next 5 months. She asked if we could have dinner sometime. Just the two of us, no occasion, no agenda. I said yes. I told her to come on a Saturday afternoon and I would make tourtière, the one from the old recipe her grandmother had brought from Quebec that she had always loved. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close. Something softer. In December, I had my furnace repaired properly. The technician who came told me the heat exchanger had been going for at least 2 years, and that I had been lucky nothing worse had happened. I paid the invoice without looking at what it would mean for anything else. I knew what it would mean. It would mean I was warm. I had been cold for a long time in ways that had nothing to do with the temperature. I bought myself a new winter coat, the kind with the serious insulation I had always told myself was an unnecessary expense. Wool blend, deep green, the color of the forest behind the house where I grew up in Nova Scotia. I wore it to my Saturday morning walk along the river trail, and I felt, in the simplest, most uncomplicated way, like myself. Not like someone's mother in a way that had required constant self-erasure, like Dorothy, who had spent 32 years in hospitals keeping other people alive, and had earned the right to be warm on a winter morning. My daughter came for dinner in January. She arrived with a bottle of wine she had chosen carefully, not the expensive label she would have brought to impress someone, but a good Ontario Riesling from a winery she remembered I liked. She hung up her own coat. She asked if she could help in the kitchen, and she actually helped. Not the performative hovering of someone waiting to be told everything is fine, but the real help of someone learning to be present in a room they had forgotten how to simply inhabit. We ate at the kitchen table. The old one, with the water ring from a plant I had kept there for years. We talked about small things, and then, gradually, larger ones. She told me she had started working with a financial counselor, that she and my son-in-law were looking at their actual numbers for perhaps the first time, the real numbers, what they earned and what they spent, and what the distance between those two things had required of someone else. She said looking at the real numbers had been one of the harder things she had done in recent memory. I told her that the truth tends to cost something up front and save you considerably more in the long run. She looked at her hands around the wine glass for a moment, and then she looked at me, and she nodded. After dinner, she helped me with the dishes the way she had when she was 12 years old, standing beside me at the sink, passing things to dry. We did not fill every silence. Some of them we just let sit, and they were not uncomfortable. They were the silence of two people relearning how to be in a room together, without needing anything from the other person except their company. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway. A real hug, Not the brief, efficient clasp of someone managing a social obligation, but the hug of someone who has missed their mother and knows it now in a way they did not before. I stood on the porch after her taillights disappeared around the corner, and I let the cold air move across my face for a moment before going inside. The neighborhood was quiet, the way small-town Ontario goes quiet in January, that particular stillness that is not emptiness but rest. Somewhere down the street, someone had a light on in their kitchen. I thought about all the small, ordinary lives happening simultaneously in all those lit windows, all the accumulated choices and sacrifices, and moments of clarity people carry without anyone knowing. I thought about how long I had kept myself small in the belief that smallness was the same as generosity. I went inside and locked the door, and turned on the lamp in the living room. I sat in the armchair I had always liked best. The one I used to feel vaguely guilty about sitting in because sitting still in the middle of the day had always felt like something I had not earned. I picked up the book I had been reading in small increments for 3 months because there had always been something else more pressing. I read for 2 hours. I did not answer my phone. I did not check anything. I simply read. In my warm house, in my own chair, in the life I had quietly reclaimed from the slow erosion of years. There is a particular kind of freedom that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with an event or a single decision. It settles into your life slowly, the way warmth settles into a room after the furnace has been properly repaired. You notice it gradually. You are not bracing for the next thing. You are not calculating what can be postponed to cover what cannot. You are not making yourself smaller to fit into someone else's blueprint for who you are supposed to be. I had learned, later than I would have liked, that you can love someone completely and still refuse to hollow yourself out for them. That generosity is only generosity when it is freely given without quiet devastation. That the people who tell you to live less comfortably are usually the ones who have been living most comfortably on your silence. I know those things now. I carry them not like weights but like tools. And every morning, when I put on my green coat and walk out to the river trail in the cold January air, I carry them with me, alongside my own warm and ordinary and genuinely sufficient life. That is how freedom feels, I have decided. Not triumphant, not loud, just warm and yours. And finally, after everything, enough.